Hi guys, Andy here from Scale Model Shed, and in this video I'm going to do a basic airbrushing tutorial. And in the video I'm going to run you through some of the different paint types along with some basic thinning and airbrushing techniques. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and also if you'd like me to do a different topic in future videos. Please subscribe to the channel by clicking the shed logo in the bottom corner and give the video a like. So I thought first in this video I'd run you guys through some of the airbrushes I use. And this is without doubt my favourite airbrush, and it's an Iwata Eclipse HPCS. This airbrush has a 0.35 needle. The front nozzle of this airbrush is very easy to clean and reliable, and I've never had to replace it. It's got a steel insert tip and a metallic conical rear seat, meaning there's minimal component wear and no seals to replace. The next airbrush is a Harder & Steenbeck Infinity. This airbrush is a work of art and has a beautiful needle travel vernier at the rear. However, the nozzle is much more delicate on this airbrush and has a rear seal that needs periodically replacing. And finally, this is a Mr. Hobby Procon Boy, and it's half the price but not half the quality of the Iwata. And this airbrush has a rear needle stop adjuster and a front MAC valve. And the MAC valve restricts the airflow, so without having to change the air pressure, you can have much more control over more heavily thinned paint. The Procon Boy's front nozzle is tiny but very robust. And being almost identical to an Iwata HPCH, you can use an Iwata front nozzle wrench. One key thing to remember whilst dismantling an airbrush for cleaning is to always remove the needle forwards. This avoids any paint being drawn back past the rear seal and into the air mechanism. So now I'm going to move on to talking about paint. And here I've picked out a few types of paint that cover the main paint groups most widely used in scale modelling. So moving from left to right, first we have water-based acrylics. These paints are non-toxic and can be airbrushed with very little ventilation. They're the best paints for brush painting, but can be the most challenging to airbrush, especially when trying to do fine detail. This is mainly due to their tendency to dry on the tip of the airbrush, restricting the paint flow. However, the AK 3rd Gen and the MIG Atom paints we have here are in my opinion the very best airbrushable water-based acrylics. Next up we've got alcohol-based acrylics, excellent airbrush paint and fairly good brush paint. They're not quite as good at brush painting as the water-based acrylics due to the fact that the alcohol can evaporate out of them that much quicker. And it's also a good idea to have some decent ventilation when using the alcohol-based acrylics. And lastly we've got the lacquer paints, which are solvent or cellulose based. And these paints are the very best to airbrush but the most toxic to breathe in, and you need some positive extraction when spraying them. And the SMS paint on the far right is a pre-thinned acrylic lacquer that you can put straight in the airbrush and spray. And you'll note that all of these paints are named to be an acrylic. This is due to the acrylic being the pigment and the paint type is the carrier. And now on to thinning, and when you're first starting off I would say to always use the manufacturer's recommended thinners. This way if you're having any trouble at least you can rule out the paint being at fault. Here the Hobby Colour Aqueous and the Tamiya X20A are the isopropyl alcohol based thinners for the corresponding paints. And it's worth mentioning that these alcohol based acrylics can also be thinned with a lacquer thinner. And doing this in my opinion makes the paint spray even better and dry to a much more durable finish. Now you can thin an alcohol based acrylic with a lacquer thinner, but you can't thin a lacquer based paint with an alcohol thinner. And with the lacquer based paints generally you have a few thinning options. You have the orange top Tamiya thinner and the Mr. Colour levelling thinner, which are slow retarder type thinners. You have the standard rate Mr. Colour and Tamiya lacquer thinners. And Mr. Hobby also do a lacquer based rapid thinner. The slower retarder and levelling type thinners are very useful for spraying gloss and especially a gloss varnish. As being a slow evaporating thinner, it gives the paint time to level out. A rapid thinner is generally very useful when spraying metallics as it gives a very quick flash off time. And now onto the water based acrylics, and these are all slightly different to use. Many of these paints, such as Migamo acrylics and Vallejo Model Air, are said to spray straight from the bottle. However, I find these Atom paints and the AK Gen 3 acrylics the most proficient with minimal tip dry when doing some fine detail work. The AK 3rd Gen is too thick to airbrush straight from the bottle and needs thinning about 50-50. And after experimenting with the Atom paints, I found they will spray straight from the bottle, but they perform best when thinned about 25%. So I couldn't do an airbrushing video without having something to paint, so I threw together this 1/72 Academy Thunderbolt. And this kit went together in just a few minutes. The fit and the detail are great, and for £10.99 you really can't go wrong with these small Academy kits. To start with, I primed the model with a 1500 Mr. Surfacer spray can. So now we're going to paint it, and for this video we're going to keep things really basic and we're just going to put paint on. And I'm going to paint all the top surfaces in a Tamiya XF67. And I'm going to use the thinner that's made for the paint, which is the Tamiya X20A. Now I personally do all my paint measuring and mixing using a pipette and the airbrush cup. It doesn't matter whether it's a Mr. Hobby, a Mr. Colour, a Tamiya Lacquer or an AK Real Colour, my rule of thumb for initial thinning is always 50-50. There are certainly instances when you'd want to thin a lot more, like for instance when you're post shading. But as a general rule I would say thinning 50-50, you can't go wrong. As you can see here, starting with the thinners, I'm mixing the ratio by counting the drops out of the pipette. But for larger quantities you can always use the milliliter scale on the side of the pipette. And now on to some basic airbrushing techniques. My airbrushes are all 2 or double action airbrushes, which means down for air and back for paint. And this next part is really important to get into the hang of from the get-go, especially when spraying water-based acrylics due to their tip drying tendencies. And you want to make sure that you always maintain air going past the needle tip and you do not come off air and paint simultaneously. This ensures that there's never any paint allowed to remain on the needle tip where it can dry. As you can see here, on air, on paint, off air. After blowing off any dust that may be on the model, I first apply a thin single layer of paint. And here I'm painting about 3 inches off the model, which gives the paint fan about a ½ inch bar. And I'm not pulling the airbrush trigger all the way to the back, I'm only pulling it back far enough to apply a thin layer of paint. I then apply a second layer 90 degrees to the direction of the first layer. And this helps to ensure that the paint is completely even with no lines. Moving the airbrush very close to the model, you can apply very thin lines of paint. In this instance, the airbrush trigger only wants to be pulled back a very small amount. And you may need to drop the pressure slightly using the regulator on the compressor or a Mac valve. Often the key to successfully airbrushing fine detail is to make sure you're in a comfortable position, which to maintain things in camera shot is sometimes a luxury us YouTubers don't enjoy. And this here is a simple example of pre-shading panel lines. And here I'm not using black, I'm simply using the colour that the rest of the model is going to be sprayed. Further coats will build up evenly over the empty panel and the pre-shaded panel line, and as long as you don't go too far with your coverage, the panel lines will always maintain slightly darker. And it also gives you the option to very easily eradicate this pre-shading if necessary. So I don't usually use water-based acrylics, but I just had to try these new MIG Atom paints. And we've got them in stock here at Scale Model Shed, and I have to say they are really very good. And you can airbrush them straight from the bottle, but I did find that they work best when thinned about 25%. I found them to be amazingly free of any tip dry issues, and they spray with excellent coverage to a durable smooth finish. One thing I do with this type of paint is to mix them carefully with a brush instead of a pipette. This introduces less air into the paint and it seems to help with their performance. I didn't mask anything while painting the kit, so any overspray is touched up by going back to the Tamiya green. And finally, on the subject of cleaning, and for the lacquer and alcohol based paints I always use a standard cellulose thinner. This just melts the paint out of the airbrush and won't damage the seals. And for water based paints I'd use an acrylic airbrush cleaner such as Ultimate Modelling Products or VMS. Remember when dismantling your airbrush to always take your needle out forwards, and this is how clean your airbrush should be for it to work properly. Blocking off the front nose of the airbrush and blowing air back up into the cup can help clean the nozzle. So there we go, a really simply but effectively painted little thunderbolt. So that's it guys, please subscribe to the channel, let me know your thoughts in the comments and give the video a like. Remember to visit the shop website at scalemodelshed.co.uk. Happy modelling everyone and see you next time.